I want you to picture the icon. You probably see the image immediately in your head.
Oh, absolutely. The leather trousers.
Right. The leather trousers, the wild loose hair, the hands just absolutely gripping the microphone stand like it's the only thing tethering him to the earth.
Yeah, the defiant, unblinking stare.
Mm.
The whole Lizard King persona.
Exactly. It's the absolute embodiment of, 1960s rock and roll chaos. It's loud, it's dangerous, and it is incredibly intoxicating.
But it's also, well, it's an image burned so permanently into pop culture that it acts almost like a wall.
A wall.
Yeah, like it blocks us from seeing literally anything else behind it.
So for this deep dive, I want you to step away from the stage lights for a second. Just, leave the stadium, walk into a quiet room, and picture a totally different set of objects.
A very different vibe.
Totally. Try to visualize cardboard boxes just filled with decades of lost school notebooks, dust-covered 16mm student film reels, and a highly limited 200-copy private run of a poetry book printed on this really high-quality paper, plus 28 intensely private handwritten notebooks discovered long after his death.
And those are just filled with, corrections, crossed out lines, deliberate revisions.
Right. And when you lay those objects out on a table, the leather trousers start to look less like a fundamental identity.
They look more like a costume, a very specific, very effective costume.
Exactly. You see the leather, but you completely miss the ink. So today, we are diving into the institutional archives, historical publisher data, and these posthumous collections to make a point.
A really crucial point.
Jim Morrison wasn't just a rock star who occasionally jotted down poems on a napkin. He was a deeply committed poet who essentially used a massive rock band as his megaphone.
Which is such a fascinating way to look at him. But we do need to be careful with the parameters here.
What do you mean?
Well, looking at the archives, there is absolutely no evidence to support some tragic narrative where Morrison, secretly despised his band or felt held hostage by the music.
So he wasn't constantly plotting to escape the Doors.
Not at all. He fully embraced the theatricality of being a rock frontman. Yeah. But the thesis we're exploring is that rock stardom was merely his most visible identity.
He was his loudest frequency.
Yes. For Morrison, poetry was not some, vanity hobby he picked up later to look smart. It was the foundational structure of his entire artistic life.
It's almost like an actor who's only known for playing a massive blockbuster superhero, right?
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
But in reality, they spent their whole life writing and directing these critically acclaimed indie films that the general public just completely ignored.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It started long before the fame, ran parallel to it, and left a massive physical archive behind.
So he essentially used the pop charts as a Trojan horse. He wrapped this dense, complex poetry in a catchy rock exterior.
To sneak high-concept philosophy onto mainstream radio.
Right, but to understand how he built that Trojan horse, we have to look at the blueprint. We got to go back to a time before the leather pants even existed.
You really have to look at his childhood. Because in a July 1969 interview with Jerry Hopkins, Morrison himself traced this obsession with writing back to his preteen years.
Wait, preteens?
Yeah, he cited his very first poem. It was a piece called The Pony Express, and he wrote it in the 5th or 6th grade.
Wow, okay.
And it wasn't just a passing phase either. He kept notebooks continuously through high school and college. He was known to just write obsessively at night.
Just constantly collecting material.
Yeah, pulling language from books he devoured, testing out different rhythmic forms.
I do have to push back a little here, though.
Certainly.
Because, every moody high schooler writes terrible, melodramatic poetry.
True.
It's practically a universal rite of passage. So are we just looking back at his teenage scribbles with rose-tinted glasses because he, eventually became a global icon?
That's a totally fair question. But the archival evidence points to something much more sophisticated than just teenage angst.
Really? How so?
The intent behind those early notebooks wasn't just emotional venting. He was actively trying to separate his own voice from the massive catalog of authors he was reading.
So he was building an independent, writerly identity.
Exactly. And the proof is in the actual work.
Right, because one of those high school poems actually survives in the public record. And it's not exactly about a high school crush.
No, not at all. He wrote the poem Horse Latitudes while he was still a teenager.
And if you analyze Horse Latitudes, it is this incredibly dense, terrifying piece of literature.
It really is. It deals with nautical panic. He uses these heavy, abrasive consonants to literally mimic the physical sensation of dread.
The imagery is just so visceral. You aren't reading the diary of a confused kid. You're reading the early drafts of someone treating language as a physical material.
Like clay that can be bent and shaped. And he brings this intense obsession with words right into higher education.
Okay, so let's look at that. In 1965, he's at UCLA.
Yeah, and the institutional records from the UCLA Film and Television Archive show us this really fascinating evolution. He isn't studying literature, he's studying film.
Which is a huge distinction. He is working with words, images, and sound all at the same time.
Exactly. The university records confirm his specific technical involvement. For instance, he created a soundtrack for a 1965 student film titled 5 Situations for Camera, Recorder, and People.
That is a very 1960s art school title.
It really is. He also operated the camera on a documentary project called Patient 411, a progress report.
Oh, wow.
And this film education is kind of the skeleton key for understanding his poetry. It gave his writing what we could call a deeply cinematic organization.
Cinematic organization, I hear that phrase a lot, but I honestly struggle to picture how a static poem on a page actually operates like a movie. Like mechanically, what does that mean?
Mechanically, it means he is basically storyboarding the poem. Rather than just reporting a feeling to the reader, which is what standard pop lyrics do, Morrison's texts establish this vivid, three-dimensional mise-en-scène.
So he doesn't just say, I feel trapped.
Right. He writes about endless corridors, locked doors, expansive deserts. He populates the night with specific archetypes like killers and spectators.
Oh, I see. He's acting as a director, placing the camera in the corner of a dark room and describing the shadows.
Exactly. He treats words, images, and sound as interconnected parts of a single medium.
That concept, the poet as a film director, is brilliant. But frankly, it makes his career trajectory even more confusing to me.
How so?
Well, if he was so dedicated to the camera lens, the soundscape, and the written word, holding a microphone as a rock singer feels like a massive detour.
It seems like he abandoned the plan.
Yeah, it seems like a failure of his original goal.
It definitely looks like a detour until you examine the actual genesis of the band.
Okay, take us there.
The official history takes us to Venice Beach in the summer of 1965. Morrison randomly reconnects with Ray Manzarek, who is a fellow student from the UCLA film program. Right. Manzarek has a group, they get to talking, and he eventually invites Morrison to join. But the critical, often overlooked detail here is that Manzarek did not invite Morrison because of his vocal range.
Wait, really?
Yeah, Morrison had never even intended to be a singer.
So the frontman of one of the most iconic bands of the 20th century was recruited for what? Just his lyrics?
For his poetry.
Yeah.
Morrison recited some of his writing for Manzarek on the beach, specifically the lyrics that would eventually become Moonlight Drive.
Oh, wow, on the beach.
Yeah. Manzarek heard the cadence, the imagery, the inherent rhythm in the words. The poetry was literally the route into the music, not the other way around.
That completely flips the script on how we usually view rock history.
Totally.
Usually, a band grinds it out, they get famous, the singer gets a massive ego.
And then they try to release a high-minded book of poetry as a vanity project.
Exactly. Just to prove they're a serious artist, it's an afterthought. But here, the poet came first. The band was birthed from the concept that Morrison's language could be translated into an auditory experience.
The poetry was the engine pulling the entire train. And that profound literary foundation is stamped onto the very identity of the band.
Even the name, right?
Yes. Even their name is a literary chain of custody. They didn't pick The Doors because it sounded like a catchy pop moniker or like a cool slang term.
Right. The official band biography records that the name was lifted directly from Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception.
Which is Huxley writing about expanding human consciousness. But the chain goes even deeper than that.
Oh, right, because Huxley drew that title from the 18th century romantic poet William Blake.
Exactly. Blake famously wrote that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is. Infinite.
And Blake wasn't just a poet either. He was a visionary artist who fused text and image into a single voice.
A perfect parallel for Morrison.
So William Blake writes about the philosophical mechanics of perception in the 1700s. Huxley turns it into a seminal book title in the 1950s. And then Morrison transforms that specific literary lineage into a band name.
A lyrical theme, and eventually a massive cultural phenomenon in the 1960s. He smuggled high literature directly onto the Billboard charts.
He built a massive commercial entity on a foundation of highly esoteric poetry, but let's look at what happens when that commercial entity explodes.
The fame factor.
Yeah. Once a band is formed and the record label gets involved, there are millions of dollars on the line. The industry pressure to churn out 3-minute radio-friendly pop hits is astronomical.
Oh, for sure.
I just find it hard to believe that his dense cinematic poetry didn't get severely watered down to appease executives.
You would completely assume that, but Morrison fiercely protected his structural approach.
How?
Well, in a 1967 interview, he articulated that he viewed the band's work as an excursion into a dramatic form rather than pure songs.
Dramatic song.
Yeah. He didn't want to just write melodies. He believed that story, character development, dialogue, atmosphere, and non-melodic sound could all coexist within a single musical structure. The band was essentially his film crew.
Let's look at the evidence for that, because the sources highlight 3 key tracks that really prove he was staging dramatic poetry. First, we go back to Horse Latitudes, that high school poem.
Right.
When he finally brought it into the studio for the Doors, he didn't compromise it by forcing it into a catchy melody.
No, he preserved all of its terror. It was rebuilt on the record through strange, unpredictable rhythms, abrasive background noise, and pure vocal tension.
It operates as sound theater. It completely rejects standard musicality to serve the poem.
Exactly. Then you look at a track like The End. If you approach that 11-minute track as a pop song, it is an absolute failure.
It makes no sense on the radio. 11 minutes.
Right. But if you analyze it as a long performance text, it is a masterclass. It utilizes heavy mythic reference, specifically Oedipal themes drawn from Greek tragedy.
And he marries those themes to dramatic development and spoken word dialogue.
He abandons the compact, easily consumable shape entirely. It becomes a dramatic ritual. He is basically staging a play inside a vinyl groove.
And the third piece of evidence is when the music's over. This structure takes deeply personal, abstract desire and pairs it with massive collective anger.
It introduces images of ecological violence to a rock audience. It's a public invocation.
And there is a phenomenal piece of evidence from the archives about how this was actually received in the room. There's a concert report from 1968 documenting a show at JFK Stadium.
Oh, this is such a great detail.
There are 5,000 people in the audience, and the reporter specifically notes that the massive crowd was entirely focused on what Morrison was saying.
Just think about the power of that image. 5,000 teenagers in a stadium in 1968, an era of intense musical rebellion. And they aren't just dancing to the beat.
They are just screaming at the guitarist.
No, they are listening intently to the words.
Which proves the audience recognized they were witnessing a totally different art form. They were listening to a poet holding court.
And even today, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame officially recognizes his lyrics as beat-inspired Dionysian poetry. They acknowledge that Morrison fundamentally blurred or even erased the line between rock lyrics and formal poetry.
So the microphone wasn't the antithesis of the book. For Morrison, the concert stage was simply a new, highly amplified medium for the poem to acquire a physical body.
It was a way to force the audience to experience the poetry physically through the sheer volume of the amplifiers.
But the written word, the actual solitary physical act of putting pen to paper that never stopped, even when the amplifiers were at their loudest.
No, it didn't.
Let's talk about the sheer logistics of his life in 1969 and 1970.
It is a staggering timeline of independent work.
The Doors are at the absolute peak of their international fame. Morrison is arguably the most recognized, scrutinized, and controversial rock star on the planet.
He's everywhere.
Between endless touring, exhaustive recording sessions, navigating the press, legal troubles, you'd think he'd have zero bandwidth for anything else. What is he actually doing off stage?
He is executing a highly disciplined, completely independent publishing timeline. In 1969, he privately publishes 2 distinct books of poetry.
Privately publishes?
Yes. The first is The Lord's Notes on Vision, which leans heavily into his UCLA background. It focuses on his theories about cinema, spectatorship, and the nature of perception.
And the second one?
The second is a collection called The New Creatures.
And according to a period AUM magazine preserved in the archives, that initial printing of The Lords was incredibly limited. We are talking about a print run of roughly 200 copies.
Just 200.
I want you to really consider the psychology of that decision. He's playing to arenas of 20,000 screaming fans. He has the cultural leverage to slap his face on the cover of a book and instantly sell 1 million copies to teenagers.
Just selling it as merchandise, basically.
Well, exactly. Why on earth would he limit it to 200 copies?
It highlights this fascinating tension between mass consumption and high art exclusivity. He didn't want his poetry consumed as a souvenir of his rock stardom.
Right. He wanted it judged entirely on its own merit, by a discerning audience.
He was deliberately cultivating a quiet, writerly identity, completely walled off from his life as a chaotic touring singer. He cared more about the integrity of the text than the scale of the audience.
By 1970, though, this parallel life does move beyond just private underground circulation. Simon & Schuster, a massive traditional publisher, puts out a combined trade edition of those first 2 books.
Which is huge.
And Morrison continues the momentum by issuing a limited edition of a new, highly ambitious work, An American Prayer.
You simply do not navigate contract negotiations with major publishers like Simon & Schuster, or painstakingly curate paper stock for private editions, just for fun.
Especially while you are exhausted from a world tour.
Right. This was a continuous, disciplined program of work. The writing demanded to be seen on its own terms.
This parallel life continued right up until the very end. And there is a specific date in the archival timeline that perfectly captures the profound contrast between the myth of the rock god and the reality of the working writer.
A moment that feels almost too perfectly scripted.
You know the one. December 8th, 1970.
December 8th was his 27th birthday.
Exactly. Now, if you only consume the Lizard King myth, if you only see the leather pants, you picture a wild, destructive, chaotic rock star party. You picture excess.
Of course.
But what does the institutional record say he actually did on his 27th birthday? He spent the day at the Village Recorder in Los Angeles.
And he didn't book the studio to lay down vocals for a hit single.
No. He booked it for a dedicated, solitary spoken-word poetry session. Just him, a microphone, and his words.
It is a deeply poignant image,
Yeah.
an artist stripping away all the noise to record the bare text. And it's crucial to note that this session wasn't just some forgotten vanity tape. In 1978, years after his tragic death, the surviving members of The Doors, Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore actually retrieved that audio.
And they scored his spoken poetry with new music to create the posthumous album, An American Prayer.
Which, in many ways anticipates the blending of spoken word and music we see decades later in alternative hip-hop and modern poetry.
They placed his spoken word right at the center of a group project, essentially honoring and repeating that original dynamic from the beach in Venice.
The poetry was always the core. The band recognized it, and Morrison lived it.
But despite all of this overwhelming evidence, the books, the publishing contracts, the UCLA film records, the dedicated studio recordings, the broader cultural memory of Jim Morrison is almost entirely reduced to the scandals.
It really is.
The arrests, the stage antics, the letter, and the tragedy of dying at 27. Why did the myth swallow the man so completely?
It really comes down to the mechanics of visibility and reproduction in mass media. The myth of the dangerous, doomed rock star is an incredibly easy narrative for the media to package and repeat.
It's highly visual. It's dramatic.
Exactly. The leather, the microphone, the defiance that is a two-dimensional image that sells magazines, posters, and biographies.
Yeah.
The quiet, solitary act of sitting at a desk, crossing out adjectives. That just doesn't look cool on a t-shirt.
He used the Pop-Tarts as a Trojan horse, but eventually the horse got so big and so flashy that everyone forgot there was an army of words hidden inside it.
That's a great way to put it.
Like looking at an eclipse. The blinding, sensational flash of his rock star scandals completely washed out the quiet, consistent work of the writer.
Precisely. It isn't that the rock star was a fake persona and the poet was the real Morrison. He fully inhabited the stage as a poetic medium.
But fame made one identity vastly more visible than the other.
The spectacle simply overpowered the syntax in the public's memory.
But the syntax survived. The paper outlasted the spectacle. And that brings us to the ultimate piece of evidence, pulling this entire narrative out of the 1960s and right into the present day. If you are listening to this and you still harbor any doubts that poetry was the central pillar of his life, you need to look at the 2021 release of the collected works of Jim Morrison.
The sheer physical volume of this collection is staggering. It is a 584-page book, created in close collaboration with Morrison's estate.
It serves as the definitive, undeniable, archival proof of his lifelong dedication to the written word.
He really does.
But I'm struggling to picture a 584-page book of just lyrics. I mean, most legendary rock stars struggle to fill a standard CD booklet without padding the margins. What is actually taking up that much space?
Well, the publisher data reveals an absolute treasure trove of raw material. It contains the contents of 28 privately held handwritten notebooks. 28. It includes countless poetry drafts, a meticulous journal from his final days in Paris, an entirely unproduced film script, transcripts of his philosophical interviews, and the complete text of those dedicated poetry recordings.
The existence of 28 notebooks absolutely destroys the prevailing idea of the lazy, chaotic genius who just wandered up to a microphone and improvised his brilliance.
Right, while under the influence.
Exactly. You don't fill 28 notebooks by accident. That is the archive of a relentless worker.
And perhaps the most revealing inclusion in the entire 584-page volume is a single, posthumously discovered page that is quite literally titled, Plan for Book.
Wow. Even amidst the chaos of his life, he was looking ahead.
He was constantly organizing his thoughts, cataloging his cinematic poetry, and trying to build a permanent, enduring literary structure.
So if we look at the timeline, the institutional records, and the publishing history, what is the undeniable truth we are left with?
Yes, Jim Morrison was a rock star. He commanded the stage with a dark theatrical presence that fundamentally altered the trajectory of music.
But poetry was never just a romantic label slapped onto his legend by obsessive fans after the fact.
No. It was a rigorous, highly disciplined method of work that he sustained from his childhood attempts at the Pony Express through his cinematic studies at UCLA.
Through the deafening chaos of global fame, right up to his final, quiet days in a Paris apartment.
He didn't just leave behind a handful of iconic, timeless albums. He left an archive of writings so massive and so complex that it required decades of editorial effort just to organize it for the public. The paper trail is undeniable.
Which leaves you with a final thought to mull over the next time you hear his voice on the radio. We all know the iconic photograph. We've all seen the scandalous, leather-clad Lizard King standing in the doorway, staring us down with that famous defiance.
It's hard to miss.
But to truly understand the mind of Jim Morrison, you have to force yourself to stop staring at the myth. You have to ask yourself a simple question. What if his truest, most enduring voice isn't trapped in the grooves of his vinyl records, but is waiting quietly to be read on the thousands of pages he left behind?